So I'm joining today from Kamloops to Secwepemc territory on the unceded ancestral lands of the Secwepemc Nation in what is today Kamloops. And I'm happy to share a preliminary overview of the whole landscape approach to ecosystem-based management project that's been completed on behalf of the Healthy Landscapes program at FRI Research. So for this presentation, the main goal is really just to give a high-level overview of the project, and this will help set the stage for some of the future Healthy Landscapes Program or HLP activity team conversations, but it will also provide some introductory information for those who are joining from outside of the Healthy Landscapes Program. I'm going to start with providing a little bit of background on how this project came about and go through the objectives, and then I'll give a bit of an overview of the kind of key project components. There's a lot to unpack, so I'm definitely not making it through all the details today, but hopefully enough to kind of give an overview of what we've done and to point to some of the pieces that we'd like to follow up on and some of the place for additional conversations. So we'll talk through the whole landscape definition piece, which was a component of this project, as well as a wetlands on the landscape literature review. And as part of that literature review piece, we also put together a roadmap to guide some of the next steps for this project and how the Healthy Landscapes program could start to use some of this information that we pulled together. And I'll wrap up by talking about next steps. Before I dive in, I would just like to say a couple of thank yous. So this project was done through the FRI Research Healthy Landscapes program, with Dave providing that project oversight and guidance, as well as support from two of the past HLP coordinators as we got started on the project. We also had a small project team pulled from HLP activity team members, so with Paul LeBlanc, Courtney Miller, and Chris Watson, who provided input and early feedback to help guide the project. On the DUC side, it was definitely a team effort. We have a handful of current as well as past staff who contributed to this. But I did just really want to acknowledge Jesse Lavallee-Whiffen, who helped see this project through to the end, but also really helped to guide some of the formatting pieces so that what we ended up with was a lot more of an accessible document, I think, than where we first started. So the Healthy Landscapes program is a research partnership based at FRI Research, and I think probably most folks tuning in are familiar with the HLP. But the goal is really to bring together researchers and practitioners from industry, government, nonprofit, academia, and other organizations to advance ecosystem-based management principles, focusing on forest dynamics and disturbance in Canada's boreal region. DUC, Ducks Canada, has been part of the HLP activity team for probably over about a decade or so, and I joined back in around 2018. And one of the kind of shifts I had observed, even in kind of the fairly short time that I've been part of it, was just a growing recognition of the interconnectedness of all boreal forest ecosystems, and a growing kind of recognition and awareness of the role and importance of wetlands in the boreal landscape. And this is likely driven by a whole number of things, everything from implementation of the wetland policy in Alberta. We've seen a few recent severe fire seasons that have included quite severe fire behavior in wetlands as well. And so a growing recognition of kind of the role and in some cases, perhaps shifting roles of wetlands with respect to wildfire. A focus on other values such as carbon and biodiversity, as well as a growing community of wetland researchers and practitioners, and so just more information available to kind of bring into the fold. Similarly, we've been seeing increasingly complex challenges in resource management. Things are not getting simpler, and so everything from navigating climate change adaptation and mitigation, biodiversity loss, water security, alongside also maintaining the economic values that drive many of the resource activities out on the landscape, and really needing to bring together diverse perspectives to navigate these challenges and to find solutions. And so as part of kind of all this broader context, one of the conversations that came up fairly regularly was the need to continue to widen the HLP's approach beyond the boundaries of managed forests and to work towards what we started to call a whole landscape approach. And when we look towards the boreal and the western boreal forest, wetlands are a really dominant part of the landscape. They can be between 30 to 50% of the land base. And so it was a kind of a natural starting point to look towards wetlands. The other part that I wanted to note too, so I had also tuned into the last webinar in this series, looking at the socioeconomics of ecosystem-based management in Canadian forest ecosystems. And this actually did a really great job of setting the stage for some of the pieces that we'll talk about as part of this project. The holidays do feel like that was ages ago at this point, but they really did identify some of the principles of EBM that could use attention on the socioeconomic side that link back to some of the work here. And so integrating ecological, social, and economic goals to really provide some of those growth opportunities for industry, First Nations, government, and NGOs. Opportunities to kind of expand partnership pieces and to bring in other partners and collaborators into conversations around EBM, as well as the integration of traditional knowledge systems with contemporary scientific research and continuing to grow in this space. And so kind of more specifically for where this project came from, we as an HLP recognize that the boreal forest is a mosaic of upland and wetland ecosystems, and in this case, really focusing on the western boreal forest. And that functioning wetlands benefit upland forests by contributing to forest productivity and resiliency, mitigating the effects of upland harvest on streams and water bodies, influencing wildfire behavior and patterns, mitigating the effects of climate change through carbon storage and sequestration, and a variety of other values and functions. And so historically, a large focus of forest management really was on the parts of the land base that are considered protective or managed areas, and areas that are actively managed. And so as EBM has become a priority for forest management companies, and the definition of EBM encompasses kind of that diversity of ecosystem types as well as interest groups. The language we use is often still quite forestry centric. And so one of the opportunities through this project was both to kind of take a step back and to look at opportunities to bring in information about all parts of the landscape, both to kind of recognize that highly interconnected nature of boreal landscapes, but also to start to shift some of the language used as well to create opportunities for kind of other groups to join in and to see themselves in the concepts that we're discussing. And so one of the kind of recognized gaps within the HLP was really that we didn't always have that same level of information in a number of projects in the past when it came to the non-merchantable, unproductive, and other parts of the land base. And so this could either come in the form of not necessarily having the same level of inventories or information about successional dynamics or fire behavior, management techniques, or even knowing what wetlands are located where. And that this was a really big gap when wetlands can make up a huge portion of the areas being managed. The other piece is that, as I mentioned earlier, wetlands are a growing field of study. And so through this project, there was an opportunity to essentially take stock of where our current state of knowledge is at and to see how that aligns with the work that the HLP is doing and where there's opportunities to bring those pieces together. And so through this, we were looking to develop a baseline understanding for the HLP of recent and ongoing wetlands research and really keying in on the pieces that are relevant to our conversations around ecosystem-based management. To identify some of those key knowledge gaps, as well as opportunities for future projects, whether they're ones that the HLP program itself could advance or to keep an eye on and to identify some of those potential collaborators through that work. So a little context before I head into the objectives of the project, but it is really intended to be a first step in the direction of a whole landscape approach. We don't intend to get everything exactly right and have an end, like a defined endpoint right from the documents we produced. I think there's going to be a lot of conversations that stem from what we've pulled together. And in particular, there's a few pieces, such as we developed a whole landscape definition document, a roadmap. We've identified a number of knowledge gaps, a contact list, and these are very much intended to be living documents that can be updated as we move forward, as we expect this information to change and to kind of continuously be renewed. And even kind of the literature review fact sheet components of it, we expect to not have to update quite as continuously, but those will also shift over time too. The other pieces is this project wasn't intended to be, I guess, all-encompassing. We do say this whole landscape approach, and when we talk about kind of objective one, the definition and classification system, we really did take that let's ensure we're bringing in and encompassing all parts of the landscape. But for the second objective, the focus really was on the wetland components of the landscape. So filling that is a key knowledge gap. And so there may be additional opportunities as we go forward to bring in some of the other ecosystem types that don't fall under managed forest or wetland categories, but are still of interest and value for to be considering as part of this type of approach. The other piece is that we should acknowledge that we very much approach this from a Western science perspective. And I think this is a key gap in the work that we've done so far. And one of the things we'll want to look towards filling in the future. And I think this is especially important given that the intent is a whole landscape approach, and this necessitates us to consider both all parts of the landscape and to broaden the language used to be more inclusive of different groups, and not just other groups being Western science or NGOs or others coming from those perspectives, but all folks who are engaged in land management decisions. So the first objective of this project was to pull together a whole landscape definition and classification system to gather and reconcile definitions of how landscapes are partitioned from various government, non-government, and management agencies, and to pull these together in kind of a short reference document for the HLP. The second was a little more all-encompassing and again focused on the wetlands components. But to conduct a literature review, and we ended up kind of reformatting how we defined a literature review through this, to cover the current state of knowledge and available tools, identify knowledge gaps and potential opportunities, as well as key contacts and potential collaborators. So I won't dwell on this part too long, but essentially we have two deliverables from these projects, and we're just in the kind of final stages of pulling them together and being able to share them with folks. And we'll share those through FRI Research's channels, as well as we'll use some of our DUC channels to get them out in the world too. But they are, the first one for the first objective was a short document providing that definition and classification system for the whole landscape. And the second being the literature review document with the fact sheets, roadmap, who is working in this space, and all of those compiled together. We may look at a few different varieties of formatting, because part of the intent behind doing kind of a fact sheet topic-based approach was that people could come and just pick the ones that are most relevant to them. So we'll look at a few different ways to be able to share these once we get there. All right, so if we dive into the first part, objective one of the project, we're looking at creating a standardized terminology that can help bring together diverse groups under a common understanding. One of the underlying goals of the project was to start to shift some of the terminology used and to change the focus on how the landscape is viewed, to be more inclusive of different perspectives and values, and to capture that full suite of values that's provided by the entire landscape. And so current approaches to EBM as a forest management paradigm in the boreal forest have really focused on those upland forested portions of the landscape, often referred to as upland, contributing, productive, active, or working land base. And this language can sometimes reflect a prioritization of values. And so, for example, productive versus non-productive is defined oftentimes through that timber management lens, which isn't necessarily neutral or universal. And so areas that are labeled as non-productive for timber are often productive for other ecological goods and services, such as wildlife habitat or water filtration. And I think starting to look at some of these language pieces, it speaks a little bit to what Gary and Jeremy touched on in their talk previously, that there's opportunities for partnership with a wide range of groups. But to do so requires finding some of that common ground and common language as well, and ensuring that both through our language, but also how we're talking about the landscape and how we're considering as part of projects that we're encompassing all components, and not just components as components, but also the interactions between them. So for this document, we pulled together a definition of a whole landscape, a working definition, I will say, as well as a working high-level classification system that could be used by the HLP to inform future projects. So we identified three important considerations that bring some additional complexity to a whole landscape approach. We also fully recognize that it's not easy to transcend boundaries, and that there's reasons that there are challenges in managing some of those connections across ecosystems. And so some of the pieces we pulled out were around administrative boundaries, and recognizing that these don't necessarily reflect ecological boundaries, and that can be a significant barrier to achieving a whole landscape approach. So some of the boundaries may factor into an ecological land classification. Others may guide what is of interest to a group without referencing necessarily the underlying ecological classification of the area within the boundary. And some of the ones we kind of looked at and considered include boundaries around parks and protected areas, around private land, government boundaries, indigenous and traditional land use boundaries, forest management, so kind of defined tenure areas and managed areas, as well as boundaries relevant to other industries, mining leases and that sort of thing, and regulated environmental boundaries. And so all of these can create those somewhat artificial, if you will, lines on a map that are still always needing to be considered, and can add that complexity when trying to take an ecosystem-based management approach that considers across the landscape. The other piece we looked at was around anthropogenic activities and modifiers, that these are an important consideration for a whole landscape classification, but it can be really a challenge to integrate this information depending on the scope and scale of the activity. So whether you're looking at a mine site versus a linear disturbance, changes to the activity footprint over time. So things like vegetation regeneration after a disturbance, overlapping activities. So when you have, say, a seismic line through a harvest area, and availability of spatial information. So not always having access to things like decommissioned roads, or even in some cases, active anthropogenic activities that are from a different sector or outside the scope of the work. So while most landscape classification systems include anthropogenic categories to varying levels of detail, anthropogenic boundaries definitely add a layer of complexity on top of the administrative and ecological boundaries. The other final piece here that we really wanted to note is just that recognition that landscapes change through time, as well as through space, and that landscape classifications can be static, so conducted at one point in time, whether it's past, present, or future, or dynamic, where they attempt to kind of encompass a range of conditions reflecting past, present, or future. And so in producing the static classification specifically, it's helpful to consider what is the most relevant timeline for the classification. Ecosystems or values may move around the land base over time as well. So one of the things we talked about in pulling this together was, for example, over many decades in a fire-driven ecosystem, a single patch may burn. It may go through several stages of growth before burning again. And over time, the values of that patch that the patch provides will change. And these changes may or may not be captured in a classification depending on the time frame, and whether, again, it's that static, moment at a time versus a dynamic. As well, pressure to maintain certain ecosystem types or values, so things like old forest in a specific place can present additional challenges for a whole landscape approach. As we've touched on, we pulled together then this working definition. And so the goal in defining the whole landscape and setting a whole landscape approach is to recognize that ecosystems are highly interconnected, and to start to move away from management approaches that exclude the unproductive land base, or the parts that are typically, or in some cases, taken out of consideration. In removing certain areas from forest management, land managers not fully capture the values or risk that these areas contribute. And by including these areas, we can practice an approach to EBM that focuses on the health and resilience of all ecosystems. And so the working definition that the group came up with for a whole landscape approach is the collection of all landforms within an area, from hills and rivers to wetlands and forests, A whole landscape approach considers all landscape components, recognizes the interconnectedness of these components, and values the perspectives of diverse stakeholders. And so again, this definition does represent that Western science perspective, and we view it as a first step toward the goal of developing kind of a more holistic definition of the whole landscape. We recognize even things like the inclusion of the word stakeholders is something that may be a point for continued conversation. And there may be pieces that didn't even enter into our conversation. So I think this is our starting point for when we go back to the HLP activity team to start with, and then as well as we kind of look towards ongoing conversations around how to use the definition and going forward. The second objective for the project was to develop a classification hierarchy to provide a common neutral language and approach for HLP members and for future HLP projects. The Healthy Landscapes program spans multiple jurisdictions and sectors. There's folks from government, from industry, from other groups and communities, and members may be required or prefer to use a different classification system in their work. The purpose of the one we pulled together as part of this project, and that's presented here, is not to replace classification systems that are already in use, but really to identify, at least where it's possible, the common denominators across multiple classification systems. And that's one of the reasons why we kept this pretty high level. It doesn't go into the level of detail that is found in many regional classification systems that go even, 1 or 2 levels beyond what we have included here. The system we pulled together is intended to apply across all areas that the HLP works, with a specific focus on the Western boreal. But to identify the common denominators and develop what we pulled together, we did go through classification systems from BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, many of which encompass areas that are outside of HLP's area of focus. So for example, encompasses Southern Alberta as well. The classification system first partitions the landscape into natural cover versus anthropogenic land use, and then natural cover into water versus vegetated versus bare. And this was a pretty common kind of 2 levels of grouping that we saw in a number of the regional classification systems as well. This was our first take with input from the project team, and something we'll be looking to take back to the broader HLP activity team as well. The other piece that we wanted to do to really tie objective 1 to objective 2, and part of the impetus to this was to highlight where wetlands fit within this classification system. And so under the natural cover grouping, shallow open water wetlands are here in purple and found under the water grouping of natural cover. Other wetland types are found under the vegetated wetland grouping specifically, with treed bogs, treed pens, and treed swamps under the tree-dominated, shrubby bog, shrubby fen, and shrubby swamp under the shrub-dominated, and open bog, graminoid fen, and marsh under the graminoid forb-dominated, with an asterisk of open bogs being moss dominated. So as I've mentioned throughout, we've got a couple next steps for kind of pulling this together. We do view this as a living document. It's kind of our starting point that we'll be looking to get input from a variety of groups and update as needed, as well as bring back forward more specifically discussion with the HLP activity team. So with that, I will dive into objective 2 of the project. So the overarching purpose of objective 2 is to summarize current knowledge and research, available resources, key researchers and organizations, and knowledge gaps in wetland related topic areas that are relevant to the HLP. And our intent here was to kind of provide an overview and introduction to boreal wetlands for HLP members, but also for anyone else who picks up this document, it will be made publicly available at the end of the project. And so it's out there as a resource and kind of an introductory piece to a number of different wetland topics. As well as to really identify those areas of intersection between those topics and the Healthy Landscapes program, to summarize key wetland knowledge gaps, again, with the lens of where can this inform either current or future and proposed projects through the HLP. And as part of that, kind of pulling that information together into a roadmap for future research. And so for the document, we took what we're calling, for lack of a better word, a fact sheet approach, where we identified a number of wetland topics, where we saw kind of opportunities to summarize current state of knowledge and research, and again, specifically where we saw overlap in applications to the work that the program's doing. We ended up kind of naturally grouping fact sheets into 3 overarching categories, looking at wetlands on the landscape. This section builds that kind of foundational knowledge of wetlands, covering topics ranging from wetland values, why are wetlands important, what other aspects or what aspects of wetlands do we want to consider, to a little bit of deeper dives into topics like wetland hydrology and wetland soil carbon. Section 2 then looks at the state of knowledge around natural disturbances, primarily focusing on wildfire, but we also included one on beavers. And then section 3 covers anthropogenic disturbances or activities, including resource roads, forced harvest, and cumulative effects. We did have a challenging time narrowing down the topics and figuring out the right level of detail as well. And so there's a few topics that were in kind of like our first rounds and our first cuts where we maybe didn't have quite as much information or didn't see as many intersections or didn't have the wetland specific information. So things like kind of pests and disease under wetlands in the landscape that could, be future topics to add in as we build up our knowledge in some of those areas or as research progresses. We also went through a few different iterations to get to the level of detail we did. And so for some of them, I suspect there may be interest in even a deeper dive, particularly when it comes to some of the fire, wildfire, and wetlands topics. And for others, such as wetland hydrology, we simplified it, but not to the most simple you could possibly go. And so there might be some where there's some room for kind of shifting around the level of information that's there. In addition to the fact sheets themselves, each of the 3 sections has its own kind of compilation of knowledge gaps. And we group these by section for a couple of reasons. One is so that the fact sheets themselves wouldn't become outdated quite as quickly as we kind of work through a number of those knowledge gaps. And we, I mean, research community as a whole. But also so that they could be a little more applicable to folks who are picking them up outside of the HLP as well, because the knowledge gaps are through more of that healthy landscapes lens. And finally, we pulled together those key knowledge gaps from across the 3 sections to build the first draft of a roadmap for the HLP, where we identify 6 priority areas and kind of broad topics where we might start to look to bring in wetlands and look for those intersections. And finally, we've got a who is working in the space. So I'm pulling together, resources, literature, and all those pieces on a range of topics. Also gave us the opportunity to see who is working on all the different pieces and to pull that together into a bit of a contact list, if you will, that we can use to identify opportunities for collaboration or research to watch as we move forward. So I don't, of course, have time to dive into every aspect of this document. So for the remainder of our presentation, we'll give a brief kind of overview of what the fact sheet format looks like, and then just kind of a brief intro to each of the sections, and then end with the roadmap. So this is an example of a fact sheet. They include an introduction to the topic, key information, and kind of like research summary, as well as a list of resources and citations. And so the resources are different than the citations in that these are really intended to be places where someone could go to either get applied materials on the topic where those exist. So things like in the case of a wetland classification fact sheet, links to trainings, to field guides, and to kind of those practical pieces that exist out there, or where those may not necessarily exist. Use it to highlight kind of tools or syntheses and kind of those more applied pieces as opposed to just the literature. So the first section is wetlands on the landscape. More than 2/3 of Canada's Western boreal forest is covered by aquatic ecosystems in some way or form, including wetlands, but also encompassing lakes and rivers and streams. And boreal wetlands are diverse, they're complex, they're highly interconnected, and contain a wealth of ecological, social, and economic benefits. But there's a lot to learn, and there's a lot of research that's been happening and continues to happen. And so the intent of this section was to really kind of lay that foundation of knowledge. We've included fact sheets on topics from wetland values, connectivity, recognizing, especially in the context of the HLP, understanding a little bit more about those connections between wetlands and different wetland types, but also between uplands and wetlands is a really key consideration. Wetland classification and inventories. These are key pieces that are really valuable as part of the kind of modeling work and landscape scale modeling work that is done through the HLP. Wetland hydrology, soil carbon, and of course, climate change are the other ones to cover it in this section. So, well, there's definitely a growing body of research. There's also a lot of things we still don't know. And that includes both kind of on the detailed, on the research side in terms of, questions we might not know the answer to. So, how do we effectively capture the, true depth of shallow water as part of a wetland inventory, but also very much on the applied side as well. So how do we, develop the tools we need to move some of the research into practice? And so we've covered a little bit of both of those things, again, as they relate to the HLP as part of the knowledge gap section. And so just some examples that we've included in here are looking at the availability of wetland inventories, economic valuations of ecosystem services and wetlands specifically, predicted wetland change under climate change scenarios, as well as carbon mapping and modeling. And the lists are quite a bit more exhaustive and more detailed than this, but those are just an example of kind of the broad areas of knowledge gaps that were identified. So the next section is looking at natural disturbances. The Western boreal forest is a disturbance-driven ecosystem with wildfire insect outbreaks, blowdowns, and beaver impoundments as the primary natural disturbances influencing water resources and wetlands specifically. Wildfire currently has the greatest impact on boreal wetlands of the kind of range of disturbance types, as well as surrounding ecosystems and global carbon stores and climate. And wildfire is really one of the starting points for this project too, and discussions within the Healthy Landscapes program is really getting a bit of a better handle on what does wildfire behavior, wildfire risk, wildfire management within wetlands look like, and what are some of the key considerations there? And especially recognizing and seeing kind of some of the shifts with continued land use change, coupled with climate change of wetlands that may have in the past been, fire refugia or wet areas and serving as fire breaks may not necessarily be playing the same role now and into the future. And so starting to get a little bit of a handle on what are some of the dynamics there. So the topics covered in this section include wetland fire behavior, post-fire successional dynamics, looking at Indigenous fire stewardship, managing wetlands for fire risk, and then our odd one out because we couldn't help but cover, but also because it links to some of the conversations around wildfire as well, but is also kind of valuable in its own right, is looking at wetlands and beavers and some of the kind of opportunities and considerations there. Similar to kind of building our foundational knowledge of wetland functions, there's also a growing body of research, and in the last several years, emerging researchers focused on wetlands and wildfire. And I say wetlands broadly, but really the focus is on primarily on peatlands and treed wetland systems, as this is where we see kind of some of the greatest potential for burning. We see, wetlands with deep organic soils being quite vulnerable if they are no longer water saturated, and impacted by some of the landscape changes as well as climate change across the land base. And so we do talk about wetlands broadly throughout this section and as part of knowledge gaps. But really, the reason peatlands get highlighted in a number of places is just because peatlands and treed wetlands is because of those additional vulnerabilities and topics of interest. And so some of the examples of what we pulled together for gaps, knowledge gaps under this section include improving understanding of how wetland age, vegetation composition, and hydrology contribute to fire behavior, estimating greenhouse gas emissions from wetland fires, improving understanding of fire return intervals in wetlands, and starting to look at effectiveness of prescribed burning and other fire management approaches in wetlands, as well as some of, again, like the socioeconomic considerations around those pieces. Whose responsibility is it? Who needs to be involved? And those questions. The final section, which is, I think, the smallest of the three, is really looking at some of the overlaps between other industry activities and wetlands, and where some of those interests intersect with the HLP. And so, again, this is one where if we just focused on kind of wetlands and other industry activities, so, we could have probably blown the section up even more. But I think really the key kind of question in this context is similar for wetlands as it is for uplands, which is trying to understand how do we bring in other sectors. I think, again, this came up in some of Gary and Jeremy's work around kind of the role for the energy sector specifically, but also for other industry sectors, whether that be mining, utilities, peat harvesting, and kind of coming into these conversations around ecosystem-based management. If we're looking at trying to figure out approaches to how we bring groups together as a whole and manage the landscape as a whole. And so again, here I'll just provide a couple of examples so that I have a little bit of time to go through kind of how we compiled all these pieces and where the roadmap itself will take us. But again, there is quite a bit of research happening in the space, at least relative to the past. It does not outpace the number of knowledge gaps we have. And I think some of the really kind of interesting pieces here for us to consider are around cumulative effects, as well as the interacting effects of anthropogenic activities and climate change. And of course, on the, not just what do these look like from kind of an ecological perspective, but even on the socioeconomic side of how do we engage, diverse groups in these conversations and bring them together in an effective way, are probably some of the key challenges under considering the wetlands and anthropogenic disturbances in the whole landscape approach. All right, so in my last couple of slides, I will go through where we landed with our draft roadmap for the HLP stemming from this program. I say HLP roadmap, but HLP roadmap from whole landscape wetlands approach perspective. So recognizing that this really is just a component of where we could go and the breadth of the work that the Healthy Landscape program does. I think there's things I should highlight here too that could lead to kind of specific and wetland focused projects. But I think even more broadly, one of our goals through this project was to kind of introduce some of these topics, identify where there's research links, who's working on those links, what are some of those key questions, so we can start to embed it in other projects as they come up, where there's those natural overlaps. And so that we just kind of build up that baseline awareness to be able to make those connections a little more fluidly. So the starting point for the roadmap is really incorporating information from section 1, wetlands on the landscape, into how the HLP considers the landscape. And then once this foundational understanding is established, we can then kind of take a look at how the different disturbances, so both natural and anthropogenic disturbances, affect wetland functions and can inform ecosystem-based management. And so each of those sections then concludes, as I mentioned, with a list of knowledge gaps. And we went through those and pulled out where we saw some of those common threads and identified as our starting point kind of 6 priority areas. These being wetland inventories, so knowledge gaps around what type of wetlands are located where, what sort of materials and applied pieces do we need to inform that, climate change, fire behavior, fire management, cumulative effects, and Indigenous knowledge. And so I'll do kind of a brief run through of each of these, recognizing I won't have time to kind of do a deep dive into them. So give a whirlwind overview of all the pieces and can follow up with questions or additional information from here and once we've shared the report as well. So under wetland inventories, this certainly comes up as a key gap. And even before the start of the project, one of the things we recognized could be a challenge, especially when working as the HLP across multiple jurisdictions. So wetlands, I mean, it is improving, but we're certainly historically not always well captured in land inventories. And so oftentimes we've needed kind of detailed and up-to-date specific wetland inventories, and these are still very valuable. To date, these have primarily been done kind of on a project-by-project basis, leaving knowledge gaps and knowledge gaps, leaving data gaps, so not necessarily covering, you know, the entirety of a province or of a geographic area of interest. And so some of our opportunities are around completing and maintaining up-to-date inventory, so filling some of those gaps, but also revisiting areas that might have been mapped 20 years ago or more, where when we come back to kind of that static dynamic landscape classification may no longer be up to date, as well as developing new approaches to kind of remotely monitor and bringing in AI and machine learning to our classification methods to make them easier to update over time. Climate change, again, is kind of permeates all of the information gaps and sections in some way or form. And I think there's a couple of key opportunities we can start to look at and questions that likely factor into some ongoing projects. So for example, DUC through our Institute for Wetlands and Waterfowl Research is currently leading a boreal climate change modeling study where we're looking to model predicted wetland abundance and distribution across the Western boreal forest. And this could provide some kind of valuable information around wetland change and predicted wetland change that could then be used as part of HLP projects going forward. And there's a handful of other key opportunities that we can look to explore as part of kind of bringing in the climate change pieces. For fire behavior, some of our key knowledge gaps include understanding how factors such as wetland age, vegetation composition, and hydrology influence wetland wildfire behavior. Some of that information does exist, but continuing to kind of enhance and improve those understandings, and especially in that context of continued landscape change and climate change. Also understanding what are some of those landscape scale variables, and assessing how fire severity, intensity, and return intervals then affect as well wetland post-fire recovery and succession. So similar to some of the shifts we're seeing in upland areas around fire intensity, and that perhaps shifting what we've assumed to be true in the past around successional patterns, what does that look like in wetlands as well? The fire management side, I think, is another really interesting piece to explore. And it is something that deserves probably much more time and attention than I can do here. But I think starting to look at are there approaches, whether they be through prescribed burning or mechanical approaches to manage fire risk in wetlands or the places where that is needed. And again, what are those policy, legal, organizational kind of challenges and considerations around managing fire risk in wetland areas? Will be some of the interesting pieces to explore. The last two, so cumulative effects. Again, coming back to opportunities to kind of understand current and predicted footprint as really a starting point. not just, of any one activity, but of cumulative industry activities across the Western boreal forest. So if we're taking that whole landscape approach to ecosystem-based management, and considering all components of the landscape, but also all activities on the landscape, even just that starting point of understanding what are those activities can be a challenge in some areas. As well as the, again, social, political, economic barriers for understanding how everyone works together on these pieces. And lastly is one I kind of alluded to throughout, and specifically for the definition document, but it also applies to kind of identifying knowledge gaps and opportunities for future projects, is really looking to bring other knowledge systems into our conversations around a whole landscape approach, and looking to see how we can incorporate Indigenous knowledge specifically into both, as a starting point, the whole landscape definition and classification systems, but also into a number of kind of the questions and topics and projects that came up through this work. And so that's a fairly whirlwind overview. I mentioned a number of these pieces are living documents. One of our key next steps will be getting some of that input for the HLP activity team, as well as working towards finalizing and sharing those documents so that they can be made available to anyone who wants to do a bit of a deeper dive into some of the pieces that I covered today.